Stop me if you've heard this before. Ghibli food looks so good. Why is Ghibli food so delicious? Ghibli food in my mouth. Yum yum yum. Gang gang gang. It is a stereotypical social media post to the point of irony poison that has been destroyed by the internet. But has anyone actually tried to answer this question, as well as talk about where the emphasis on food even comes from? Well, if we go over here to the Japanese corner, you may have heard of this concept, especially around these topics that was talked about quite a bit, called taberu. Now, taberu means to eat. You see, in Japanese culture, it's very important that you eat food, because if you don't, you might even starve. And here lies the problem with the culture corner. You see, it's easy to fall into traps when we talk about this from an outsider's perspective. See, the thing that might be brought up quite a lot is washoku. It means Japanese cuisine, but there's a bit more to it than just that. It also defines itself as a nostalgia before Western influence in its Japanese communities. And even if it did get itself on the UNESCO list, with all the bells and whistles that come with that, the way it got there was through wrangling it, making it the broadest possible term it could do, and doing its homework and making sure it hits all the ticks to get on that list. Which means that it's effectively a form of gastro-diplomacy as soft power. So when we start using those talking points, we might as well get a paycheck out of it, right? Because it's such a broad and undefined term in terms of the actual Japanese culture of cuisine. There are so many different variations within Japan all over, and they're all quite different, lest we say Tokyo's the only place that matters. And speaking of Tokyo, if we're getting to Ghibli, we need to start right at the top with the Tokyo foodie himself, Hayao Miyazaki, who actually does have some experience in his youth that he talks about in his book about Japanese, Tokyo, downtown food culture.
I once heard from a friend who lived in the crowded old town area. He'd become quite disgusted as a child because he had to eat the same side dishes every day. He would smell eggplant and horse mackerel boiled in soy sauce. He disliked the bluish fish. So he would reportedly think, oh, not again this evening. But buying inexpensive side dishes was an important part of old downtown culture. Ordering food from established restaurants, on the other hand, was a real luxury.
Japan's post-war period was defined a lot by food scarcity. Luckily, that didn't affect Miyazaki's middle-class family that much. And with that upbringing came a lot of opportunities to learn about things like European culture and cuisine, which came in very useful at his first job at Toei Animation, where a lot of those later movies used food for gags in a slapstick manner, as you would see in maybe a Golden Age cartoon. However, the genesis of the Ghibli food cut came in 1972 from Go Panda Go. This was the mindchild of Miyazaki. It liked to use splashes of comedy, but now we have a lot more focus on that cooking. Yet it really all comes together in next year's Heidi, A Girl in the Alps, with an eclectic selection of meals pushing the limits of TV animation at that time. A real highlight comes in episode 2, where we get the first food cut. It shows the simple pleasures of eating a good meal and draws out the processes every step, leaving Heidi's enthusiasm all the more gratifying by the end. One in-betweener said that this actually popularized natural cheeses in Japan, although proving that is a little bit difficult. But anyway, getting back to it, when we talk about animation production, you can't give it all to Miyazaki. See, he wasn't actually the director of either of these. That was actually Isao Takahata, his partner in crime. Even if Miyazaki did give some help on the storyboards, his main job was always going to be the layouts. That is until he leaves Takahata to become his own man, his own director in the late 70s, and that would split their approaches to food animation in half. While Takahata was inspired by Miyazaki and Miyazaki was inspired by Takahata, Takahata specifically wanted to do things that Miyazaki would never and go in his own path. He came from a background of French literature, and that defined his approach to animation as well, which was a bit more on the side of documentary realism. And when asked specifically what the differences are between Miyazaki and Isao Takahata's approaches, the animation director at Ghibli, Kitaro Kosaka, said of this.
Takahata's work is mainly founded on intellect, on rationality. Miyazaki, on the contrary, relies on a sensuality, a sensibility.
When it comes to food, you can see that Takahata likes to be a bit more period specific. He likes to tone it down a little bit. But he's not against pushing up the tongue-in-cheek comedy. You know, sometimes mixing the delicious with the grotesque just to get a reaction out of the audience. Food was a defining factor in his first movie at Ghibli, Grave of the Fireflies. The author relayed in an interview about how a stolen tomato could claw your way out of death, but also brought a kind of vibrancy from the said contrast of the situation. As the war wages on, the disparity gets worse by the day, and the rationing gets thinner and thinner. On the other side, Miyazaki's food cuts are consistent through his career. They are exaggerated, full of motion, cartoony, and they like to go beyond realism, better than even.
We didn't really use any references, and Miyazaki especially would have hated it if we'd done that. Use imagination, not research material. That's what he would say.
I'm sure that's a lot easier when you have a photographic memory like the director. But yeah, he's looking for a perfect outcome, even for simple dishes. I mean, Laputa is showing me the hell up. I can't even cut bread straight without cutting my finger open. And what the hell are they doing there? Like, man. And when it comes to Halleck Pie, even when the exhibition is doing their best to recreate it, they can't compare with the original animation. But Miyazaki also loves the reaction. It's about who's going to eat it, how they're going to eat it, and the way they're going to eat it. And surprisingly, this is one area where the philosophy of both directors actually intertwine. They both are quite interested in that idea of how people eat. And that's despite Takahata's movies changing quite a bit stylistically over time.
Food that is still warm, that looks soft and tender, with the wonderful flavour showing on the faces of those eating it. These scenes of meals are appealing and charming. No dialogue is needed to convey the deliciousness and happiness.
And as you can see, it's all about that world building and how you can define a lot without saying anything when it comes to food. But let's forget about everything we just heard, because Toshio Suzuki, the man at the top of this studio, has something to say about why there's so much delicious food in Ghibli movies.
It's because it's all food that Miyazaki himself has actually made.
Well, that's case closed, right? Or is it? You see, Toshio Suzuki isn't the most trustworthy. He'll usually do anything he can to emphasize Miyazaki when asked a question. But this one kind of doesn't make sense, because what about all the movies that aren't directed by Miyazaki that have food in them? And what about the people at Ghibli who also cook besides him? It seems to want to negate everyone else at the studio, including the countless amount of animators who have animated these cuts over the years, including people like Atoko Tanaka, who's gotten quite a specialty for food cuts. She started working with Miyazaki in the late 70s, you see with like Cagliostro here. One of her most famous is Howl's Moving Castle, with the breakfast scene, where she mixes the magical and the mundane. It varies the timing of each piece of animation. The smoke sizzles slower, the hand motions come in at a different tempo than Calcifer's animation. And then, while it's all slowing down in tempo, you see that quick flick of Calcifer's fire, just to get the best reaction from the audience. Takahata can't draw, so he really is reliant on this team to do their best to convey his ideas. And when it comes to movies from him, I feel Only Yesterday is the one that gets the most attention for its lavish food cuts, especially since there's so much agriculture and farmland going through. Now, it's a bit harder to find who did what cut here. It's a little bit more loose. Some cuts are alleged to be done by Makiko Futaki, who is known for her intricate foliage shots at the studio. It's true that Takahata has always been really big on reference and recording, but there could be another reason for why he's so meticulous about food prep. You see, the melon shot in Grave of the Fireflies was not up to his standards, but because of the schedule, it just wasn't something they could fix in time. He said it was too soft, looks like tofu. So when it comes to his final movie here, you can see he gets really into taking as much reference and recordings as possible so he could get this melon shot just right, fixing the sins of the past. And that's not to say Miyazaki isn't meticulous in his own ways, because he gets very specific in this early training course during the early 90s.
拳一つもついてないよ。ぴったりくっついて飯食ってみな。ちょっと座って。すごいものあるだろ。こういうのはね、観察って書いてないんだよ。
Although it does seem like Miyazaki has softened up on the idea about reference by the time of the new millennium. With relative newcomer animator here, Yonebayashi, he gets to look at certain recordings with these new digital cameras to try and really focus on how he's going to do this eat in sequence. He recounted on his Twitter years later that it took about 3 retakes to get this shot just right, with each of the corrections getting a little bit more jelly-like each time. I guess you could say he's a little bit like the Sushi Police. Now, who are the Sushi Police? It gets a little complicated. In the world of washoku, this is probably its most embarrassing moment when the Japanese government decided, maybe we should control how our food is tested or authenticated abroad. It meant that they played strong-arm Yakuza with international restaurants, or at least attempted to, but they were basically laughed out by everyone in the room because there are multiple factors on display here where that's just not a very practical thing to do. I mean, who gets to define what a Japanese dish even is, since we have so many regional disparities on that, like what's to say this isn't the right way of doing it, or even just the case that a lot of the times when you have foreign restaurants in different places, they will use the sort of local cuisine to cater to that audience. It's not uncommon. You should look at some of those Chinese restaurants in Ireland. They're quite a trip, I'll say that much. It was just an embarrassing moment, getting criticism from all angles, so the Japanese government quietly threw the idea away. And the legacy of this silliness was turned into an animated series known as The Sushi Police, which did not have the most flattering interpretation of what that idea was in the end. Now, if Japan had their way, I'm sure they would have had the Japanese Sushi Police going and knocking down the doors of animation studios too, saying, I don't know if those noodles look quite authentic enough, draw them again. If they had done that, they might be coming after me, because today I'm going to be drawing some Japanese noodles a little later on to show my own example of how to make a Ghibli food cart. And really, the only person or people who should be telling me what I should be doing in that instance are my patrons. Yes, let's go. This was supposed to be an improv 2 video, went a little funky. I'm glad we got the support of people like Lenny, Tim Danger Richards, Joven, Daniel Strait, Ashkarao, Strategin, Stratos, Chunks, Jay, Fox Mulder, OT, Paul, Steam's Mom, Subsofa, Takayuki Suzuki, Karen, Systematic, Nick, Doji, how's it going? And Peter, helping us out in this situation. And if you want to help out, please join the list of everyone around and make sure that these sort of stupid ideas come to fruition. It was even one of my patrons who even suggested half jokingly this idea for a video. Now let's get back to the video. And yet it isn't even just on the animators, so we got to talk about the colouring department. You see, there's a lot of colours to getting things in food just right. If we look at Heidi, yeah, this banquet doesn't look bad animation-wise, but the single colour food doesn't really seem as appealing as some of the later work, which is much more multi-shaded. Now, when you're working with a movie budget, you have 10 times the colour than a TV show, and you can do all sorts of things with that to make the food look as luscious as possible. As Miyazaki says, these are the delicious colours, and you've got to figure that out. Sometimes that takes a little bit of prep yourself, a little bit of research, looking at actual menus and other pieces of food to really get a feel for what should it look like. Now, the person behind the department who is in charge of the colour palette itself is Yasuda. She works on both Takahata's and Miyazaki's films, and you can see it when she's working specifically with Miyazaki. There's always a strong contrast of the colours. They use the colour also to sort of infer the texture, and that gets really strong with something like The Wind Rises. As the digital era has made the process twice as fast as it used to be, and now colour is no object, you see a lot more variety in luscious food post Princess Mononoke. And that could only really be possible through the outsourcing companies such as Dr. Movie from Korea, who works on Spirited Away, or T2, who does the variety of films afterwards. And they can't really do that without these very detailed layouts and Genga, giving them all the information they need. The free tone system connects the textures and the line work together, and all that needs to then be connected to the art department. So it's all about the harmonies. These are things that are usually painted on cells in high detail because they aren't going to move, so they can be as luscious as possible. And you can see right here, when you think it's going to move, they need to right back to the cell. And then, of course, the art department needs to make those backgrounds made of gouache and sort of softer textures to bring whatever food it is to the forefront. And all those important elements are then combined in the photography department, who then might add things like smoke and glistening on top to make it all come together. Of course, Ghibli knows this is part of their brand, so they've commodified the hell of it with cookbooks and exhibitions and even restaurants and tie-in events. And I guess so they should do.
Well, you gotta put your money where your mouth is, right? So we're about to do it. We're gonna make a Ghibli food cut. Now, originally I was going for something like the Miyazaki noodles clip, because I thought it would kind of be funny to go with that whole like, oh, it's always because Miyazaki makes it. But the footage itself is a bit too low res, and I couldn't find a really good angle in it where I'd be like, alright, that seems right. So I ended up going back to one of those core philosophies in experiencing it in real life, and I made myself some noodles, and I wanted to go for something like ponyo. I wanted those thick, graceful lines, that sort of more hand-painted color palette look to it all. Started looking at some of the timing and sequences they've already done with food in the film. I wanted to make a background also traditional in the Ghibli fashion. Now, I didn't have any gouache, that stuff is really expensive, but I did have a bunch of watercolors, so I decided to sort of watercolor out a background and use some color pencils too, try and get that sort of vibe that Ponyo has going. Now, I couldn't get it as dark as I wanted to because unfortunately I ran out of watercolor paper, and I was just like, oh, I'll just use some of this less thick stuff I've got around. That's a bad move, and it made it all creasy, and I kind of made more work for myself by doing that, because when you don't prep the paper properly, which I didn't, it can only take so much stuff into the paper. So I couldn't go super dark on it, and I was like, okay, well, I'll scan it in, and then we'll like do the extra sort of more darker layers on top through digital stuff. Now, the next problem came with like the color palette. Now, I was basically featuring it off Ponyo, fell into, in retrospect, what I thought was a trap here. Made the tiles similar to the color of the tiles in my kitchen, and realized that actually, with the whole scene I was doing, that was probably not the best move in the world, because if you're going to have mainly your hand moving around those tiles, you have two very similar colors like bouncing off each other on top of another similar sort of like tone with the ramen broth. So I had these three similar colors hitting each other where if there could have been some potential for some better contrast there. So looking back at something like Howl's Moving Castle, I wanted to do a lot of secondary animation in it. But that became a little bit more difficult when I realized, oh god, so there's going to be all the fire plumes, and then it's going to be the smoke, and then I had to remember how to draw smoke plumes properly, and I spent way too long like correcting them and kind of feeling it out, and I don't know if it really worked in the end, but trying to figure out like how I could simplify this and make it work was pretty difficult. In the end, it comes down to how you cut the corners. Now, I don't have to work at Studio Ghibli, I just needed to make it look close enough for the concept here. So a lot of that came to like, how are we going to be smart about this? How do we reuse frames and flip frames, and how do we do that to make the most out of the least amount of drawings to save the most amount of time? I did my first two sort of roughs of the line work digitally. I don't want to feel like I'm emulating the process of Ghibli where most of their line work is still done on paper. So I made a maybe foolish decision to do my second pass over on line work, and then printed out all those drawings on paper and brought them to the light box and bought a nice new pack of very good pencils. I've never really bought good pencils before, and I went in. Didn't perhaps do as much construction, which meant when I did get into drawing them again on paper, there was a lot of me having to like work out the construction of what actually was going on, because my cleanup was still too messy in some of those areas, especially early on where like my original footage I was sort of looking towards to help at times was a bit blurry with the hand movements. I had like so many flashbacks to the Dynamic Hands book. I should have spent more time studying these things, because it's one thing to draw hands static, it's another thing to draw them entirely when they have such an intricate flow of movements. Even after finishing the pencils, I had to do so many corrections because I noticed like I messed up most of the fingers. The line work was definitely quite a difficult one. How much shadow we're using, and how much will you see the bones or the articulation in the knuckles and stuff like that. And a lot of that was kind of pulled back, and it was mainly just the form. So you had to have that form really down. So I removed a lot of the layers of sort of like noise, construction I had created in the original roughs. After about a week of all that animating, my wrist gave out, and I was still going, but now I'm drawing traditionally. So I was trying my hardest to not destroy my wrist, but I could start feeling it in my separate fingers. Like I was feeling the pain all in my thumb. So I had to be probably quite soft with my line work after a while. Like I definitely get fainter the further I go on. Maybe means I couldn't have gone as thick as I would have probably liked. I tried a program called Cadmium, which is a program that take your paintwork and it can sort of modulate that and fill in the frames for you to a degree. The caveat here, I suppose, for anyone who wants to use this program, I think it's a worthwhile thing to try out and experiment with. For stuff that isn't a lot of movement, it's actually pretty useful, and it exports all the separate colors as their own image sequences, which can be very helpful if you want to like bring it into a different program to do your finishing. The issue, I think, is how well it can capture articulate paintwork. I didn't think I went that hard on it because I tried to keep it quite flat, but it did struggle to capture all the information. You do have quite a potential with the program to sort of come back in and adjust what it's given you and sort of fill in different areas. It's pretty convenient for filling in areas. The advice I'd give with it, if the movement in the picture changes dramatically, say for example, if your hand is rotating all the time and that's changing the sort of shape of it, you probably should do more than one filled in color shot. Another thing I should have done would have been, I should have actually really figured out the construction of the noodles and how they move through the water, or how I want the sort of broth to look. So having to go back into it and painting it and winging it, probably spent way more time doing that than if I had sort of like figured out a rough like construction of how I wanted it to go. Now, something else which I don't think they'd have to think about is I wanted it to loop quite nicely in the context of what its environment will be, which is trying to trick people on Twitter. So I wanted the cut to be really smooth between the hand leaving and then it going back to zero. And I think I got that quite well actually, and I think that's one of the better things about this. And it was very much an endless process of touch up and adjusting throughout the whole thing in stuff I should have locked down, but I'm just not that kind of guy. I can't lock things down that easy. So I was just constantly thinking about my construction and trying to learn on the fly. It was 2 weeks plus, maybe 3 weeks, depending on how you count it. Like I had to take some days off because my wrist, barely 4 seconds out. It kind of gives you a feeling about the absolute scale of a Studio Ghibli when you have to do every little bit. Because originally I was like, okay, I'd like to see if I can make something that's really pretty convincing that people would actually mistake it maybe if they weren't thinking straight. I don't know if I'm going to convince anyone this is from Ghibli. If I had done something a bit simpler, I probably could have got it there. But I got to mediocrity, which isn't so bad, I guess. You could go a lot worse. And it was a learning experience for myself. Even when you know how to do it all, it's still really hard. And I don't know if it looks that tasty.
So if you want to help share the chaos, you can go on my Twitter at @STEVEM and retweet it and whatever else. And we'll see if we can convince some people. And I want to dedicate this video to my late cat Squeak of about 20 years. She has been a mainstay of the channel since the beginning and has interrupted every recording session I have ever done, including the one for this video. As well as being featured in pretty much every stream, and I know some of the community are fairly attached to her, so I thought I'd best to tell you now, and you can leave your respect in the comments. Next time, hopefully, we'll be talking about The Boy and the Heron.